Hi, everybody. Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll, Tishusta, Slandak Malchina. I'm Stephanie Carroll. I'm Atna from the native village of Clutie Ka along the Copper River in Alaska, and I'm assistant professor at the University of Arizona. And I'll be talking to you about sovereignty and governance for Indigenous data futures today. Indigenous knowledge systems are informed by longitudinal inquiry lasting generations. Indigenous communities form, test, adapt, and refine their knowledge systems based upon careful observation. Many Indigenous cultures utilize a variety of oral and physical mechanisms for transmitting knowledge and information. Here are some different tools for storing and conveying information and data in North America, starting from the left clockwise, a totem pole, the Lakota winter count, an autumn calendar stick, and a wampum belt. However, by and large, the settler colonial experience has been comprised of various efforts to kill, suppress, or co-opt Indigenous knowledge systems. Today, Indigenous peoples' data include data generated by Indigenous peoples, as well as by governments, private sector, and other institutions on and about Indigenous peoples and territories. Indigenous peoples' data comprise information and knowledge about the environment, lands, skies, resources, and non-humans with which they have relations, information about Indigenous individuals such as administrative, census, health, social, commercial, and corporate, and information and knowledge about Indigenous peoples as collectives, including traditional and cultural information, oral histories, ancestral and clan knowledge, cultural sites, stories, and belongings. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern their data from collection and storage to use and reuse. Finding its foundations in inherent sovereignty, only Indigenous peoples and nations as rights holders can exercise Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty is a responsibility and an expression of the ways, traditions, and roles that communities have for the care and use of their knowledge. Using a human rights framework, Indigenous data sovereignty leverages tools such as laws, policies, and agreements, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, nation-state recognition of Indigenous peoples, treaties, and other mechanisms. Indigenous data sovereignty underscores that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. Data are critical to the exercise of tribal sovereignty. Indigenous peoples require data for governance and self-determined decision-making. When activating Indigenous data sovereignty, Native nations and other data agents replace external, non-tribal norms and priorities with tribal systems that define data, control how it's collected, and influence how it's used. It results in findings derived from both external data collected on Indigenous peoples and from internal data produced by Native nations that reflect the understandings of those peoples. At the same time, Indigenous nations, like many other governments and institutions, create and enact data policies and practices that align with their values and knowledge systems. These activities of Indigenous data government are means of implementing greater Indigenous data sovereignty. What we see now is that as Indigenous nations rebuild their governance systems, they are also reclaiming their data systems. Currently, Indigenous peoples often face a state of data dependency, where Indigenous data and tribal data systems have long been suppressed and usurped to meet others' needs and desires, such as the federal government's reporting requirement, questions asked in research that are defined by outside inquiry and not informed by community needs, and so on. This slide itself could be an entire presentation, but the takeaway message is that every day Indigenous communities engage with a variety of data systems and actors, resulting in data that are created by other data actors for their own needs, by other data actors for Indigenous peoples, by other data actors with Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples for Indigenous peoples, by Indigenous peoples for others, and by Indigenous peoples with others. Each situation will continue to occur given the vast array of situations in which data are created, stored, and used today. However, in each, there's an opportunity to strengthen relationships to ensure Indigenous peoples' collective rights to define, control, access, protect, and use data. Indigenous data governance is the application of Indigenous ways of knowing to the management and control of Indigenous data broadly. Indigenous nations have various levels of control or possession of their data, with high levels of control over their tribal enrollment data and very little control over social and corporate data. Thus, data work for Indigenous nations as rights holders requires enhancing relationships with other data stakeholders and experts. These relationships with other data actors and stakeholders are necessary both for the expertise in collecting, accessing, and using data for governance, as well as through relationships where external data stewards manage Indigenous data by Indigenous standards. Given resource constraints, it also requires decision-making to identify what data are most important to protect or share. Communities of practice and advocacy exist through Indigenous data sovereignty-focused networks in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, as well as Indigenous data sovereignty activities and many other areas across the globe. Formed in 2019, the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, is an international network of networks that promotes Indigenous control of Indigenous data, reinforcing the rights to engage in decision-making in accordance with Indigenous values and collective interests. The very first GIDA activity was to finalize and then release high-level principles for the governance of Indigenous data. In response to increased generation and use of data in open data, big data, open science, and research environments, and limited opportunities for Indigenous control, a network of Indigenous scholars led the foundational research, the drafting, the open commenting and editing, and the finalization of the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. In 2019, GIDA released the CARE principles, which set forth critical considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and users, and are designed to guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in data governance and increase their access to data. The CARE principles shift the focus of data governance from consultation to values-based relationships and have been widely recognized as enriching the discussion of collective rights to data for other populations as well. The CARE principles provide foundational guidance for researchers and others working with, using, or storing Indigenous data. The 4 principles are collective benefit, which details that data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data, for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance and citizen engagement, and for equitable outcomes. The next principle is the authority to control. Indigenous peoples' rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized and their authority to control data respected. And this goes back to recognizing rights and interests and thinking through data for governance, as well as governance of data, and how those impact researcher relationships with Indigenous peoples. Responsibility is the 3rd principle, and it details that those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. It requires positive relationships, expanding capability and capacity both for researchers as well as for communities, and should be for Indigenous languages and worldviews. The final principle centers on ethics and really underscores that Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. This means that researchers and others need to be thinking about how to let Indigenous peoples lead and identify how data and data use can minimize harm and maximize benefit, can be just, and the parameters, protocols, and practices for future use. The CARE principles bring a people and purpose orientation to data governance, which complements the data-centric nature of the popular FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The FAIR principles seek to increase data sharing. Implementation of the CARE and FAIR principles together should be seen as necessary to allow Indigenous peoples to govern, access, and use their data and to share on their own terms. Currently, the vast majority of Indigenous data, ranging from ethnographic material to biological materials to Earth observations and so on, are neither FAIR nor CARE. Indigenous collections and data can be hard to find. They can be buried in larger collections, corporate data sets, university repositories, or researcher possessions. Indigenous data are often mislabeled, do not indicate the Indigenous peoples who are related to those data, and are not searchable. Indigenous peoples largely are not the legal rights holders. Thus, Indigenous collections and data are not fair and do not perpetuate Indigenous provenance, protocols for use and sharing, or permissions. We are concerned about implementing FAIR and CARE on already existing data, as well as instituting policies and practices to ensure that the plethora of new data created every day adhere to both. Indigenous data governance can be put into place through laws, such as UNDRIP at the international level, or tribal laws, policies such as government, institutional, organizational, and professional guidelines, ethics through training, but also through labels for data, and infrastructure, so changing data standards and programming innovations. Current mechanisms include tribal data governance tools such as tribal codes and guidelines, tools employed by other institutions such as repository policies, and infrastructure tools such as data standards. But more tools are needed, as well as criteria to assess and evaluate how other institutions are enacting the CARE principles. The goal is to create law, policy, ethics, and infrastructure that support Indigenous rights to Indigenous data throughout the data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem, and to strengthen such rights by making changes, even minimal at first, across data actors such as research institutions, repositories, publishers, funders, and more. Next, I will highlight a few brief examples. So here we see the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, or ATSIS, Code of Ethics, which will be mandatory for any research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia toward the end of this year. Critically, the code, which emerged from Indigenous leadership for the co-production of the federal policy, acknowledges Indigenous people's right to manage collections, interpretation, and use of their information, the ongoing right to ownership, control, and access to research results, and the need to apply fair and care. Next, we see the traditional knowledge labels. These are digital tags that ensure protocols travel with data to maintain Indigenous community connection to the data through provenance tracking, and general purposes being permissions, such as research, education, or commercial use. The labels were created initially as an effort of the Passamaquoddy tribe to reestablish relations with the songs and the oldest known wax cylinder recordings stored at the Library of Congress. Put into place by communities, not collections or researchers, the labels correct attribution and other information and relay expectations for use. Finally, in an effort led by Maui Hudson at the University of Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Dr. Nanabe Garrison at UCLA and myself, we address how researchers can respect Indigenous rights, interests, and expectations in order to stimulate greater diversity and inclusion in genomics research by building trust, enhancing accountability, and improving equity. To these ends, we include a table with specific actions researchers can take that address Indigenous concerns and begin to fill some of the gaps left bare by current research practices that ignore collective rights and privacy concerns, such as protecting personal and community identifiers and improving publication standards and recognizing community rights and interests. In closing, I'll leave you with some ideas around operationalizing Indigenous data governance. And want to underscore that we should be leveraging international norms such as CARE and FAIR principles and UNDRIP, developing indicators for the implementation of the CARE principles, developing a strategy for bidirectional capacity enhancement and funding for infrastructure in Indigenous communities, and co-producing policy and practice to embed rights, interests, and ethics across research spheres. We also need to be promoting alternative licensing and agreement systems that support communities in their engagement with external data systems. And finally, creating, expanding, and implementing practical mechanisms within data infrastructures that embed provenance, protocol, and permissions. Thank you very much.